the news.
Hi, I'm Tessa with Brainrot News, with a few bits of news for you to choke on from April 1st. If there's one thing the Trump administration loves more than corporate tax cuts and undermining democracy, it's gutting public health infrastructure right before a crisis. In a move that screams deja vu, Trump's latest round of mass layoffs at U.S. health agencies has conveniently included the people responsible for handling the nation's response to bird flu. Yeah, you heard that right. The government just fired the experts managing the ongoing viral outbreak because apparently America hasn't learned a single lesson from COVID-19. The result? Chaos, obviously. The bird flu has already wiped out nearly 170 million birds, scrambled the egg market, and put the entire poultry industry on edge. And now, thanks to these brilliant layoffs, the agencies tasked with keeping it contained are hemorrhaging staff. But don't worry, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. assures us that this is just an effort to streamline operations and reduce bureaucracy. Effective governance is axing the very people standing between us and the next pandemic, I guess. The Agricultural Department, which apparently didn't get the memo that the end goal is total dysfunction, is scrambling to rehire some of the very same workers that were just laid off. Some of these firings were so disastrous that a federal agency had to step in and say, wait, no, this is actually a terrible idea. And let's not forget, this is all happening under an administration that still can't decide whether science is real. Between RFK Jr.'s conspiratorial nonsense and Trump's general disdain for public health, we're looking at a government that fundamentally does not care if people live or die, as long as it can trim a few government salaries and funnel more cash towards the military. If the last pandemic proved anything, it's that we need more funding for public health, not less. But instead, we're getting mass firings of disease experts, all because Trump's administration thinks science is just an expensive hobby for nerds. So what happens next? Well, the bird flu won't wait for the government to get its act together. Without the necessary personnel, outbreaks could spread further. Food supplies could take even bigger hits. And if we're really lucky, the virus could even mutate to start infecting more humans. But hey, at least we're cutting down on bureaucracy, right? This incompetence isn't just predictable, it's deliberate. The Trump administration has never cared about public health, and if we're about to get another pandemic, their only response will be the same as the last time: deny, deflect, and blame everyone else while people die. In a heartwarming display of government efficiency, ICE managed to accidentally deport Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a legally protected Maryland resident, to one of the most violent prisons in the world. They later said this was an administrative error. This is state-sanctioned cruelty dressed up as an administrative error. That's what you call a typo in a DMV form, not the forced disappearance of a legally protected resident. But let's be real, this isn't a mistake. This is ICE doing what ICE does best: terrorizing immigrants with impunity and then shrugging when lives are destroyed. Mr. Garcia fled El Salvador as a child to escape gang violence. A judge, someone who actually interprets the law instead of trampling it, ruled that in 2019, sending him back would likely get him killed. But ICE doesn't care about legal protections. They care about fulfilling the bloodthirsty demands of an administration that treats immigrants as disposable. So they kidnapped him from his construction job because, God forbid, a hardworking immigrant be allowed to, live, and shipped him straight to one of the most brutal prisons in the world. And then, as if the sheer horror of it all wasn't enough, they had the audacity to say, oops, our bad, while refusing to fix it. Because ICE isn't about protecting Americans or enforcing the law. It's about exerting unchecked power over vulnerable people. They claim Mr. Garcia has alleged gang affiliations, conveniently dragging out a vague, evidence-free accusation from a bond hearing in 2019. That's right, they don't need proof, just the magic words gang ties to justify throwing a man into a hellhole and washing their hands of it. And where's the accountability? Where's the outrage? ICE gets to destroy lives without consequence because the US treats immigrant suffering as background noise, an inconvenient truth we can all ignore. This is the same government that will tell you to trust the system, while that very system throws innocent people into cages. The same country that loves to brag about its justice while using bureaucracy as a weapon to erase people. This isn't an accident. This is a feature of a system designed to dehumanize, brutalize, and erase people who don't fit in the white nationalist fantasy of who deserves to be here. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia is just one name. How many others have been erased, disappeared, and discarded because ICE decided their lives weren't worth it? How many people have been condemned to death under the lie of, oops, we made a mistake? Because let's be honest, mistakes like this only ever seem to happen in one direction. This isn't just injustice. This is a crime, and ICE should be dismantled for it. The US Senate is currently engaged in a high-stakes game of do we listen to Trump or do we acknowledge reality? As Democrats push to reverse his tariffs on Canadian imports, these tariffs, imposed under the guise of stopping fentanyl trafficking because a war on drugs is taxing maple syrup, have managed to annoy just about everyone, including some Republicans who usually prefer their self-inflicted economic wounds a little less blatant. Leading the charge against this latest exercise in policy absurdity is Senator Tim Kaine, who, along with other Democrats, is arguing that maybe punishing Canada for America's opioid crisis isn't the smartest move. Meanwhile, GOP senators are doing their usual moral gymnastics routine. They admit the tariffs are hurting farmers, ranchers, and global markets, but they also don't want to anger Trump lest they be excommunicated from the cult. Senator Majority Leader John Thune gave a stunningly vague statement about tariffs being strategically useful for stopping drug trafficking, which is a bit like saying burning down your house is a great way to keep the burglars out. Meanwhile, Senator Steve Daines of Montana is deeply vigilant about how these tariffs affect agriculture, because nothing reassures struggling farmers more than a senator watching their financial ruin from a safe distance. And let's not forget Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who's worried about uncertainty in global markets. Newsflash, when your party follows a guy who makes economic policy decisions the same way a toddler picks dinner, randomly and with no concern for consequences, you get uncertainty. Of course, even if the Senate manages to pass this resolution, it still has to survive the Republican-controlled House, where bills go to die unless they contain tax cuts for billionaires or new ways to criminalize poverty. In the meantime, American farmers, businesses, and consumers will just have to keep suffering for the sake of Trump's fragile ego. So will the GOP choose economic stability over loyalty to their orange overlord? Or will they once again prove that they'd rather tank the economy than admit Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing? Stay tuned for the next episode of Spineless Republicans, the never-ending saga. In the latest episode of America Solves Nothing, Just Punishes People, federal prosecutors have announced they will pursue the death penalty against Luigi Mangione, the 26-year-old accused of assassinating United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, because justice is responding to murder with a murder. This decision was personally greenlit by Attorney General Pam Bondi, riding high on President Trump's renewed enthusiasm for state-sponsored executions. Why fix the healthcare system when you can just kill people instead? Mangione, a highly educated Ivy League computer science graduate, apparently left behind some very pointed messages at the scene, making it clear that his fury wasn't just personal, it was the fury of many Americans. But instead of asking why a young, intelligent man might be driven to such extreme action, the government is just slapping on a terrorism charge and preparing the needle. So now the US government suddenly cares about human life. Funny, I don't remember federal prosecutors lining up to seek justice for the thousands of people United Healthcare has functionally executed by denying them medical care. Where was the national outrage when desperate patients were rationing insulin, skipping chemotherapy, or dying in emergency rooms after being told their treatment wasn't medically necessary? Where were the terrorism charges when United Healthcare knowingly let people die for profit? But the second someone fights back, really fights back, the state mobilizes its full force. Not when people suffer, not when families lose loved ones to corporate greed, but when one CEO finally faces consequences outside of a quarterly earnings report. That's when the government decides life is valuable. That's when it calls for blood. Luigi Mangione isn't some cartoon villain. He's a symptom of a system so broken, so brutally inhumane, that someone with every reason to succeed in life felt there was no other option. And instead of asking what drove him to that point, instead of confronting the sick dystopian reality of American healthcare, the state just shrugs and says, guess we better kill him too. And let's talk about that real quick. The death penalty. Like really? As if this country hasn't already murdered enough people by withholding healthcare? As if executing Mangione will undo the actual terrorism United Healthcare and companies like it commit every single day? No. America's justice system only works to shield the powerful. No one's saying violence is the answer. But what do you expect in a country where the rich hoard life-saving resources and force the rest of us to suffer? Where your access to basic survival depends on how much money you can scrape together. You can only push people so far before they snap. And now the system wants to make an example out of Mangione. Not to deliver justice, but to make sure no one else dares to push back. They don't want you angry. They don't want you thinking about real criminals who wear suits and sit in boardrooms deciding who lives and who dies based on profit margins. They want you to accept your suffering, to shut up and die quietly. Luigi Mangione didn't, and that scares the hell out of them. In an act of sheer will and possibly superhuman lung capacity, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker has spoken for over 21 straight hours, putting up a one-man roadblock against Trump's latest round of legislative horror. As I write this, he's still speaking now. While most Democrats prefer their resistance in the form of exasperated press releases and strongly worded letters, Booker decided to make his opposition impossible to ignore by doing what few politicians ever do, actually putting in the work. This wasn't just grandstanding, this was endurance-level political combat. Booker took to the floor Monday night and just kept going, long past the point where most people would have collapsed into a heap of filibustering exhaustion. He rallied against Trump's catastrophic plan to gut Social Security, a move that would leave millions of elderly Americans choosing between food and medicine. Because if there's one thing the GOP hates more than poor people, it's old poor people. Booker also had to address Trump's increasingly deranged foreign policy, which now includes serious discussions about annexing Greenland and Canada. Because apparently when you run out of domestic policies to ruin, the next logical step is full-blown imperialism. Despite every reason to feel exhausted, demoralized, and hopeless, Booker did not stop. He pulled strength from history, invoking civil rights icons like John Lewis, because he knows this isn't just about one policy or one election, it's about the soul of the country. Booker's message was clear. History remembers those who fight. His Democratic colleagues helped out where they could, tossing him questions to let him catch his breath, probably slipping him caffeine off camera, and generally marveling at the fact that someone in their party was finally treating this moment with the urgency it deserves. This is what resistance is supposed to look like. Not just tweets, not sternly worded letters, but an all-out refusal to let this administration's cruelty slide by unnoticed. Booker's speech won't single-handedly stop Trump's policies. What it does do is remind Americans that there are still people willing to fight, to actually put their bodies, voices, and time on the line when it matters. And in a political landscape where so many Democrats seem content to play it safe, Booker just proved that the only way to confront rising fascism is to stand up and refuse to sit down. So here's to Cory Booker, the only politician in the Senate with the endurance to outlast a bad presidency in real time. May his voice hold out, because the country desperately needs more of this kind of fight. The Israeli government has done what it does best: starve, bomb, and deny while the world watches in horror. The United Nations World Food Program just announced the closure of the last remaining bakeries in Gaza, leaving millions of Palestinians with nothing to eat. Why? Because Israel's ongoing blockade has choked off food supplies to the point where even humanitarian aid organizations have been forced to throw up their hands and say there's nothing left. Meanwhile, Israel insists that it let in adequate food supplies during the 6-week truce. Well, if that's true, then where's the food? The UN is telling us they're out. Gaza's markets are empty. People are starving to death in real time. So either Israel is lying, or they've redefined adequate to mean just enough to keep people suffering, but not enough to keep them alive. And let's not forget, this isn't just some unfortunate side effect of the war. This is the war. Starvation is the policy. Systematic denial of food, water, and medicine isn't some regrettable accident. It's deliberate genocide. Israel bombs farms, blocks aid trucks, destroys water sources, and then acts surprised when people start dying en masse. That playbook hasn't changed. Push the Palestinians to the brink, force them into impossible conditions, and then blame them for ever existing at all. And as the bombs keep falling and Israel prepares yet another ground invasion, what's the world doing? Begging for a ceasefire that Israel has made clear it will never honor? Calling for restraint as an entire population is starved into submission? But let's be real, if this were happening anywhere else, if millions of civilians were being systematically starved by a Western designated enemy state, the outrage wouldn't just be moral, it would be military. Gaza is being suffocated before our eyes, and what's our country's response? A mix of hand-wringing, empty statements, and unconditional aid to the people responsible. How many more bodies have to pile up before the world stops pretending it's just a conflict and calls it what it is, a genocide? In what can only be described as a preemptive strike against public health, the US government has decided that science is a luxury we can no longer afford. Up to 10,000 employees across the NIH, FDA, and CDC have been laid off, ensuring that the next pandemic won't just be deadly, it'll be a complete surprise. This catastrophic decision-making is the brainchild of Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man best known for believing Wi-Fi is a biological weapon. He's consolidating these agencies into something called the Administration for a Healthy America, a name that screams, "We fired the experts, but trust us, everything's fine." The layoffs come courtesy of President Donald Trump, who in a stunning act of cruelty disguised as efficiency, decided that federal health workers didn't need collective bargaining rights or jobs. Now the people who regulate food safety, research deadly diseases, and track outbreaks will have plenty of time to reflect on how they should have gone into public service in a country with a sane government. State and local health departments are also bleeding out thanks to COVID-19 relief funds drying up. So if you were hoping your community might still have a functioning health system, that's adorable. A coalition of state attorneys general is suing the administration, arguing that dismantling public health infrastructure might, just might, have negative consequences. Bold take. With fewer scientists, researchers, and regulators standing between you and a public health apocalypse, it's time to start brushing up on your 14th century survival skills. Boil your water, avoid strangers, burn the bodies before the rats get them. Oh, and if your meat smells weird, just eat it anyways. There's no FDA left to recall it. Just when you thought the Trump administration had hit its quota for gutting public health, here comes another round of needless suffering, sponsored by the government. A coalition of Democratic-led senators is now suing to stop Trump from slashing $11 billion in health grants, money that was keeping infectious disease programs, mental health services, and addiction treatment afloat. Because if there's one thing Trump and his cronies hate more than basic human decency, it's funding anything that helps people survive. The lawsuit, filed in Rhode Island, makes a pretty simple argument. You can't just strip away billions in health funding and expect people not to die. But of course, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. insists this money is no longer necessary because the pandemic is over. Yes, the classic Republican strategy of pretending a crisis disappears the moment it's no longer politically convenient. Never mind the fact that COVID-19 left a wreckage of mental health crises, addiction spikes, and an overburdened healthcare system still dealing with the long-term effects. In RFK Jr.'s magical world, once the news cycle moves on, the consequences just vanish into thin air. And let's talk about what these funds were actually supporting. Addiction treatment? Gone. Disease prevention programs? Slashed. Mental health services? Absolutely not, you weaklings. The cuts even hit the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Because if there's one thing this administration excels at, it's making sure the country is as sick and unstable as possible. What's even more infuriating is the sheer pettiness of it all. This isn't about saving money. If the government really cared about the budget, maybe they'd take a look at the bloated military-industrial complex or the endless corporate tax breaks, or literally any other part of the federal spending that doesn't involve keeping vulnerable people alive. But no, the first thing to always go is public health, because there's no immediate profit in it. So now, states are forced to sue just to keep their own citizens from spiraling into avoidable suffering, and the Trump administration, they'll fight tooth and nail to strip every last dollar, because nothing makes them happier than making life as cruel as possible for the people they're supposed to serve. If this lawsuit fails, the consequences will be deadly, but don't expect Trump or RFK Jr. to care. After all, their real healthcare plan has always been the same. Let the weak die off and call it fiscal responsibility. In the latest episode of Destroy Everything and Call It Reform, the Trump administration has abolished the U.S. Department of Education, because if there's one thing authoritarian regimes hate, it's an educated population that can think for itself. And for an extra kick of cruelty, they've also thrown the $1.6 trillion student loan system into the lap of the Small Business Administration, an agency that knows as much about student loans as Trump knows about reading. So what's the result? Absolute financial chaos for students, law schools, and anyone who is planning to go to college without being born into wealth. Nearly half of the education department staff is being laid off, while the SBA, already understaffed, is somehow supposed to take over managing millions of student loans. The obvious consequence? Delays, incompetence, and a whole lot of students getting financially wrecked. Law school deans are sounding the alarm because their entire tuition model relies on students accessing federal loans. But with the SBA fumbling the bag, students may be forced to take out high-interest private loans or drop out altogether. This isn't just about law students, though. If the SBA can't handle basic disbursements, expect similar chaos across all higher education. What's better than skyrocketing tuition costs? Skyrocketing tuition costs plus predatory private lenders. And let's not forget the real goal here: making college unaffordable for working class people. The Republican dream is an education system where rich kids go to elite schools and poor kids get stuck with underfunded trade programs, if they get anything at all, and student debt becomes an even bigger financial trap than it already is. This isn't about efficiency or cutting bureaucracy. This is about making sure higher education is a privilege for the wealthy and a lifelong debt sentence for anyone else. After all, an educated public asks questions, fights for its rights, and worst of all, votes against fascists. And we all know Trump can't have that. Surprise, surprise, Russia has rejected Trump's so-called peace proposal on Ukraine, proving once again that Moscow has no real interest in ending this war until Ukraine no longer exists as an independent nation. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov claims that the US plan doesn't address the root cause of the war, which in Kremlin speak means it doesn't let Putin take Ukraine and call it a day. According to the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Moscow takes the American proposal seriously, which is diplomatic code for we skimmed the email email and laughed, but says they failed to address the root causes of the war, which if you ask Putin, means Ukraine still exists as an independent country. The Kremlin wants Kiev to agree to a laundry list of humiliating conditions, including giving up 4 occupied regions, abandoning NATO membership forever, and downsizing its military, just in case Russia gets bored and wants to roll in again. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine sees this as an outright demand for surrender. Meanwhile, Trump is reportedly frustrated with Putin. Yes, the man who spent years kissing the Kremlin's boots is now shocked that Russia isn't playing nice. So what's Trump's big counter move? Threatening secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian oil, because clearly the best way to negotiate peace is to start an economic fight with half the planet. Brilliant strategy, really. At this point, it's painfully obvious what this peace deal was. It was never about Ukraine's sovereignty or security. It's about Trump trying to score a quick photo op ceasefire where he can act like he solved a crisis that he fundamentally does not understand. He wants a deal where Ukraine is told to roll over, Russia gets to keep what it stole, and the war gets wrapped up neatly. But here's the thing, Russia doesn't even respect Trump enough to take the bait. They know they can stall and push for more concessions, and why wouldn't they? The Trump administration has already shown he's perfectly happy gutting NATO, cutting aid to Ukraine, and giving Putin everything he wants on a silver platter. Ukraine gets hung out to dry, and Russia keeps pushing for total domination. But sure, let's keep pretending that a man who thinks Finland is part of Russia is capable of complex diplomacy. That's all for Brainrot News. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because the only thing more broken than America's healthcare is America's news.